The bulletproof glass didn't just crack. It pulverized into a million diamond-edged shards that shredded my tactical vest like it was wet tissue paper. That was the first thing they never told us in the security briefings at the Pentagon. They told us about the depth of the concrete, the redundancy of the servers, and the invincibility of the American Aegis. But they never mentioned that a human jaw, if driven by a viral load high enough to liquefy the frontal lobe, could bite through a reinforced Lexan barrier. I heard the scream then. It wasn't a scream like you hear in the movies. It wasn't a high-pitched Hollywood wail. It was a wet, rattling roar that sounded like someone trying to gargle a handful of gravel and blood. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My boots skidded on the polished linoleum of the E-ring, the smell of ozone and burnt coffee thick in the air. The emergency lights were strobing a rhythmic, sickening crimson, turning the hallway into a series of disconnected snapshots. A severed hand clutching a BlackBerry, a spilled Starbucks latte mixing with a pool of dark arterial spray, and the shadow of something hunched and twitching just around the corner of the corridor. I was 24 years old, a junior analyst for the Defense Intelligence Agency, and I was currently trapped in the most secure building on the planet with 3,000 things that used to be my coworkers. My name is Elias, and this is how I survived the first day of the end of the world. The lockdown had happened at 0800 hours. We were in a briefing about anomalous seismic activity in the Midwest when the sirens started. Not the drill sirens. These were the "we are under atmospheric or biological attack" sirens. The heavy blast doors hissed shut, sealing the 5 rings of the Pentagon into 5 concentric circles of hell. We were supposed to be safe. We were the brain of the U.S. military. But the virus didn't come from outside. It didn't come on a missile or in a suitcase. It started in the cafeteria, a bad batch of something, or maybe a targeted strike on the food supply. By 0900, the screams started. By 1000, the screaming stopped, and the wet slapping sounds began. I managed to duck into a maintenance closet near the center courtyard. The space was cramped, smelling of floor wax and stale air. I sat there for hours, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Outside the door, I could hear the sounds of the American dream dying. I heard General Miller, a man I'd seen on C-SPAN a dozen times, begging for his life before his throat was torn out. I heard the sound of a heavy desk being overturned, followed by the crunch of bone. I thought about my parents back in Ohio. I thought about my dog Buster waiting by the front door of my tiny apartment in Arlington, wondering why I wasn't home to feed him. That realization hit me harder than the fear, the sheer domestic normalcy of the life I'd lost in a single morning. By day 3, the hunger was a physical weight in my gut. I had to move. I cracked the door, my hand trembling on the handle. The hallway was silent, save for the hum of the HVAC system, which was now pumping in the faint, sweet scent of rot. I saw them then, a group of 4, dressed in suits that cost more than my car, now tattered and stained. They were standing in a circle, their heads bowed as if in prayer, but their bodies were swaying in that hideous, rhythmic twitch. I gripped my only weapon, a heavy metal flashlight, and stepped out. The one in the lead, a former colonel I recognized from the logistics department, turned his head. His eyes were gone, replaced by a milky, clouded film, and his jaw hung at an impossible angle. He didn't growl. He just lunged. I swung the flashlight. With everything I had, the thunk of metal hitting skull vibrating up my arm. He went down, but the others were on me. I scrambled back, my sneakers slipping on the slick floor, and bolted toward the stairs. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay in the E-ring. I had to get deeper. I had to find a way to the basement levels where the emergency rations were stored. I made it to the stairwell, Slamming the heavy steel door and sliding the deadbolt, I leaned against it, gasping for air, the taste of copper and panic in my mouth. I was on day 5, and the real nightmare was just beginning. The Pentagon is a maze. It's a city within a city, and without power, it's a tomb. By day 12, I'd scavenged a tactical vest and a sidearm from a fallen MP near the north entrance. The gun felt heavy, alien in my hand. I'd grown up in a house where the most dangerous thing was a lawnmower. Yet here I was, checking the chamber of a Beretta like a seasoned operator. The silence was the worst part. Every few hours, a distant scream would echo through the vents, or I'd hear the sound of something heavy dragging itself across the floor above me. I started talking to myself just to hear a human voice. I talked about the 4th of July fireworks on the National Mall, the way the light hit the Potomac at dusk, and the taste of a real cheeseburger. These memories felt like they belonged to another person, a ghost from a world that had been erased. By day 30, I reached the sub-basement. The air was colder here, damp and smelling of old paper. I found a secure server room that had its own independent power supply. For the first time in a month, I saw light that wasn't from a flickering emergency bulb. I sat in the glow of 100 blinking blue LEDs, weeping silently. I found a terminal that was still logged in. I searched for news, for anything from the outside. The reports were fragmented, terrifying. New York was a dark zone. Chicago was burning. The last transmission from the White House was a looped message telling citizens to stay indoors and pray. There was no rescue coming. The Pentagon was supposed to be the command center for the counteroffensive, but the command center was dead. I spent the next month turning that server room into a fortress. I scavenged the nearby vending machines, living on stale Cheetos and diet soda. I felt my body changing, thinning out, my nerves fraying, until every shadow looked like a lunging horror. I began to realize that surviving wasn't just about staying alive. It was about not losing my mind. On day 64, the vents brought a new sound. Scratching. Something was in the ductwork. I sat in the corner of my server room, the Beretta aimed at the ceiling, my eyes wide and bloodshot. I waited for hours. Then a panel fell. A creature, thin and pale as a maggot, dropped to the floor. It was a child, or it had been. It was wearing a visitor badge. It looked at me with those vacant, milky eyes and hissed. I didn't hesitate. I couldn't afford to. The crack of the gunshot was deafening in the small room. The muzzle flash blinding me for a second. When the smoke cleared, the thing was still. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a monster. By day 80, my supplies were gone. I was drinking condensation off the pipes and chewing on leather strips from my belt to keep the hunger pangs at bay. I knew I had to make a break for the surface. I'd seen a map of the underground tunnels that led toward the river. If I could get to the Potomac, maybe I could find a boat. Maybe there was a community, a colony, something left of the world I knew. I gathered my gear, my hands shaking not from fear, but from exhaustion. I opened the door to my sanctuary and stepped out into the dark. The hallways were different now. The rot had progressed, the smell so thick you could almost taste it. I moved like a ghost, hugging the walls, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of the inner rings. I passed the cafeteria, where it all started. The doors were bent outward, as if something massive had forced its way through. Inside, I saw movement, hundreds of them, huddled together for warmth or out of some vestigial social instinct. they weren't twitching anymore. They were waiting. I realized then that they were evolving. They were getting faster, quieter. I made it to the tunnel entrance on day 92. The door was mag-locked, requiring a high-level clearance I didn't have. I spent 3 days trying to bypass the system, my fingers bleeding as I picked at the wiring. On the 95th day, the lock hissed open. I felt a rush of cool, fresh air, the first I'd smelled in over 3 months. It smelled like rain and mud and life. But as I stepped into the tunnel, I saw the lights at the other end. Not sunlight, flashlights. And then I heard the clicking of assault rifles being leveled. "Identify yourself," a voice boomed, amplified by a megaphone. It was human. It was American. But the tone wasn't one of rescue. It was a threat. I stood there, a skeletal figure in a shredded suit, holding a rusted flashlight and a gun with 1 bullet left. I had survived 100 days in the Pentagon, only to realize that the world outside might be even more dangerous than the one I'd left behind. My name is Elias, and I am a survivor, but I'm starting to think that surviving was the easy part. I didn't drop the gun. My hand shook, the metal of the Beretta cold and slick with the sweat of a man who hadn't showered in 14 weeks. But I didn't drop it. The megaphone's echo died out, swallowed by the damp concrete walls of the tunnel, leaving only the high-pitched hum of my own tinnitus and the distant rhythmic thud of a generator. These men were clean. Their tactical vests were matte black, free of the dried gore that encrusted my own sleeves. Their goggles glowed with a faint, predatory green. They looked like gods descended into a tomb, and I must have looked like a ghost clawing its way back from the sticks. I didn't speak because my throat was a desert, the vocal cords fused together by days of silence and the inhalation of drywall dust and rot. One of the figures stepped forward, his rifle never wavering from my chest. He signaled with a gloved hand, and 2 others flanked him, their movements precise, practiced, and entirely devoid of the frantic, stumbling desperation of the things I had been killing for the last 95 days. They didn't see a survivor. They saw a variable, a biological risk, a piece of debris to be cleared. The leader reached out and snatched the flashlight from my hand, the rusted casing clattering against his high-end gear. He shone a light directly into my eyes, and for a moment the world was nothing but a blinding, searing white. I felt my knees buckle. I hadn't seen light this bright since the power grid flickered out during the initial breach in the B-ring. I collapsed, not out of surrender, but because my nervous system simply surrendered for me. I hit the wet floor, and the last thing I felt was the cold barrel of a carbine pressed against the base of my skull and the sharp medicinal sting of a sedative being slammed into my neck. When I woke up, the smell of rain was gone, replaced by the overwhelming, sterile scent of bleach and ozone. My wrists were zip-tied to the arms of a metal chair. I was in a small, windowless room, a holding cell, likely one of the deep subterranean bunkers beneath the Raven Rock complex, or an undisclosed site near the river. Day 96 was a blur of fluorescent lights that burned my retinas and the sound of a ticking clock. I stared at that clock for hours. It was the first time I'd known the exact second of my existence in months. In the Pentagon, time was measured in the length of shadows cast by emergency glow sticks and the frequency of the scratching sounds behind the vents. Here, it was a mechanical precision that felt more terrifying than the chaos. A man in a charcoal suit, his face a map of exhaustion and institutional coldness, sat across from me. He didn't offer water. He didn't offer a blanket for the shivers that racked my emaciated frame. He wanted to know about the black box protocols in the Secretary of Defense's private suite. He wanted to know if I'd seen the courier from the National Security Agency on day 12. He spoke as if the world hadn't ended, as if there were still reports to file and hierarchies to maintain. I tried to tell him about the way the cafeteria workers had turned into a screaming tide of teeth. I tried to tell him about the colonel I'd watched eat his own hand in the dark. But the man in the suit didn't care about the dead. He cared about the data. He called me Asset 4022. And in that moment, the psychological weight of the last 3 months hit me harder than any physical blow. I wasn't a hero for surviving. I was a witness to a failure they were still trying to categorize. By day 97, the interrogation shifted. They realized I wasn't a spy or a looter. I was just a man who had been too stubborn to die. They gave me a cup of lukewarm water and a protein bar that tasted like chalk and hope. My body revolted, my stomach cramping as it tried to remember how to process solid food. Through the thick plexiglass of the door, I caught glimpses of the world they were building. It wasn't a restoration of the old world. It was a militarized hive. Soldiers moved with grim faces, carrying crates of ammunition and sealed canisters of what I assumed were chemical agents. There was no chatter, no laughter. The outside I had dreamed of, the one with blue skies and the sound of birds, was a fantasy. The reality was a fortress of steel and fear, where every person was a potential carrier and every shadow was a threat. I learned from a sympathetic guard, a kid no older than 20, with eyes that had seen too much, that the Pentagon was considered a red zone zero. They weren't there to rescue survivors. They were there to sanitize the site and recover what remained of the command and control infrastructure. I was an anomaly. I shouldn't have been alive. The kid told me that the cities were gone, not just fallen, but erased. DC was a graveyard of monuments and madness. The fresh air I smelled in the tunnel was just a localized pocket of ventilation. The atmosphere outside was thick with the smoke of 1,000 burning suburbs. Day 98 was the day I realized I had to get out, not just from the Pentagon, but from the safety of these men. I watched the way they treated the others they'd pulled from the perimeter. There were 4 of them, huddled in a cage down the hall. Janitors, a low-level analyst, a woman who looked like she'd been hiding in a server room for weeks. They were being processed like cattle. On the morning of the 99th day, the sirens began to wail. It wasn't the rhythmic pulse of a drill. It was the frantic, uneven scream of a breach. Even here, in this fortified hole in the ground, the dead found a way. The Hollow Men, as I had come to call them, didn't need tactics or air. They only needed time and the relentless pressure of their numbers. I heard the muffled pops of gunfire from the levels above. The soldiers who had looked so invincible days ago were suddenly shouting, their voices cracking with the same primal terror I'd lived with for nearly 100 days. The power flickered. The sterile white lights hummed and died, replaced by the jarring red of the emergency strobes. In that strobe-lit nightmare, I saw my opportunity. The zip ties were tight, but my wrists were thin. Skeletal, really? I'd lost 40 pounds in the Pentagon, my muscles wasting away even as they grew corded and tough from the constant climbing and fighting. I pulled, the plastic cutting into my skin, the blood acting as a lubricant. I felt the skin tear, the heat of the friction, and then, with a sickening pop of my thumb joint, my left hand slipped free. I didn't hesitate. I didn't look for the man in the charcoal suit. I grabbed a heavy glass carafe from the interrogation table and waited by the door. When the guard opened it to move me, to liquidate the assets before the breach became total, I didn't see a human being. I saw an obstacle. I swung the carafe with a strength born of 100 days of pure, unadulterated survival instinct. The glass shattered against his temple, and he went down without a sound. I took his sidearm, a Sig Sauer, fully loaded, and his tactical vest. The weight of the gun felt different now. In the Pentagon, a gun was a prayer. Here, it was a tool. I stepped out into the hallway, the red light washing over the walls like fresh blood. The facility was in chaos. The dead had breached the ventilation shafts, their mangled bodies dropping from the ceiling like rotten fruit. The soldiers were firing blindly into the dark, their training failing them in the face of an enemy that didn't feel pain and didn't fear death. I moved through the smoke, my footsteps silent. I knew how to navigate the dark. I knew how to breathe in a way that didn't alert the things in the shadows. I was more like the monsters than the men trying to fight them. I found the woman from the server room, the only one left in the cages. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. I didn't say a word. I just shot the lock and gestured for her to follow. We weren't a team. We were just two ghosts, trying to find a way out of a haunted house. Day 100. The milestone I never thought I'd reach. I stood on a ridge overlooking what used to be Arlington. The sun was rising, but it wasn't the golden, hopeful dawn of the movies. It was a bruised, purple light, filtered through a permanent shroud of ash and soot. Behind me, the facility was a funeral pyre, smoke billowing from the ground. As the sanitization protocols finally engaged, or perhaps the dead simply overwhelmed the reactors. The Pentagon, that great concrete pentagram, sat in the distance, a silent monument to the end of an era. My suit was gone, replaced by stolen fatigues that hung off my frame. My hands were a mess of scars and fresh scabs. I looked at the woman beside me. She was shivering, staring at the horizon where the ruins of the Washington Monument stood like a broken tooth against the sky. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the one thing I'd kept from my office on that first day, a small, tarnished silver compass. The needle spun aimlessly, caught in some electromagnetic interference from the collapsing grid. I survived 100 days in the Pentagon. I survived the hunger that felt like a fire in my marrow. I survived the sound of my friends being torn apart. I survived the cold, the dark, and the crushing realization that no one was coming to save us. But as I looked out at the wasteland of the American capital, I realized the number 100 was meaningless. There was no finish line. There was no rescue. The world hadn't just changed. It had been replaced by something hungrier and more hollow. I had spent 100 days learning how to die slowly. And now I had to learn how to live in a world that didn't want me in it. I checked the magazine of the Sig Sauer. 15 rounds. It was a fortune compared to the one bullet I'd had a lifetime ago in that tunnel. I looked at the woman, then back at the smoldering horizon. The psychological toll wasn't a weight I carried. It was the skin I wore. I wasn't Elias the analyst anymore. I was a scavenger, a predator of predators, a piece of the new world's dark machinery. I turned away from the burning Pentagon and began to walk, not toward a destination, but away from the past. The first 100 days were the prologue. The real story, the one where we find out if humanity is anything more than a memory, was only just beginning. My name is Elias, and I am still here. And in a world of the dead, being here is the most dangerous thing you can be. The air was thick with the smell of scorched earth, and something metallic, like a copper penny held under the tongue. As we descended the ridge, the silence of the morning was broken by the distant, rhythmic thumping of helicopter blades. Not the clean, rhythmic sound of a patrol, but the ragged, buttering beat of a machine on its last legs. I didn't move toward it. My instincts, honed in the claustrophobic corridors of the Pentagon sublevels, screamed at me to stay low. I pulled the woman down into a ditch filled with dead leaves and the rusted husks of abandoned cars. We watched as a lone Black Hawk drifted over the tree line, smoke trailing from its tail rotor. It wasn't looking for survivors. It was dropping incendiary canisters onto a cluster of houses below. They were burning the world to save it, or perhaps just burning it because they didn't know what else to do. I felt a coldness in my chest that had nothing to do with the morning air. The institutions I had served, the symbols of power I had walked past every day for years, were now just engines of destruction. Resource scarcity was no longer about finding a stray bag of pretzels in a vending machine. It was about every breath, every bullet, every scrap of cloth. I looked at my boots. The soles were separating, held together by strips of duct tape I'd scavenged from a maintenance closet on day 82. My body was a map of survival. A jagged scar on my forearm from a broken glass partition, the deep, bruised circles under my eyes that would likely never fade, and the way my heart hitched every time a dry leaf skittered across the pavement. The psychological toll of the 100 days wasn't a sudden breakdown. It was a slow erosion of the self. I found myself thinking in terms of calories and lines of sight. I didn't think about my family anymore. The memory of their faces was a luxury that cost too much mental energy. To remember was to grieve, and to grieve was to be slow. And in this new world, the slow were the first to be consumed. As the sun climbed higher, casting long, distorted shadows across the cracked asphalt of the highway, I realized that the Pentagon hadn't been a prison. It had been a cocoon. Inside those walls, the horror was contained, localized. Outside, it was infinite. We passed a roadside diner, its windows shattered, a sign in the window that simply read, "Help," in dried brown letters. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I had one magazine, a half-liter of gray water, and a companion who was one step away from a catatonic break. Every instinct told me to leave her, to move faster, to disappear into the woods. But I didn't. Maybe that was the last shred of Elias left, the part that believed that survival without some form of humanity was just a different kind of death. We reached the edge of a suburban sprawl, the houses standing like silent sentinels. Here, the decay was more intimate. Tricycles left in driveways, front doors hanging open, a tattered flag wrapped around a porch railing. It was here that I saw my first free zombie since leaving the tunnel. It was a man, or what was left of one, wearing a tattered USPS jacket. He was standing in the middle of the street, head bowed, swaying slightly in the breeze. He wasn't hunting. He was just existing, a terminal state of being. I raised the Sig Sauer, the sight steady on the back of his head. I had the shot. It would be a mercy, but I lowered the gun. A bullet was a meal. A bullet was a life. I couldn't afford mercy anymore. We circled wide, moving through the backyards, stepping over the rotted remains of garden fences. The weight of the 100 days pressed down on me with every step. I felt The phantom pressure of the Pentagon ceiling above me, the ghost of the hum of the air filtration system. My ears still expected the sound of maglocks clicking and the distant scream of the hollow man in the vents. When I looked at the woman, I saw she was staring at her own hands, her fingers twitching in a rhythmic pattern. Maybe she was still typing reports in her head, still trying to make sense of the data that no longer mattered. We were both broken machines, functioning on backup power, navigating a landscape that had no use for us. By the afternoon of day 100, we found a small, boarded-up pharmacy. The lock had been forced, but the interior was dark and looked untouched by the initial panicked looters. I entered first, the muzzle of my gun clearing the corners of the room. The air was stale, smelling of spilled pills and peppermint. I found a stash of antibiotics, some high-calorie meal replacement shakes, and a first aid kit that felt like a king's ransom. I sat on the floor, my back against a shelf of faded greeting cards, and cracked open one of the shakes. The liquid was thick and sickly sweet, but it felt like liquid gold sliding down my throat. I handed one to the woman. She drank it in silence, her eyes never leaving the door. "What now?" she whispered. Her voice was the first human speech I'd heard outside of an interrogation or a scream in days. It sounded alien, fragile. I looked at the silver compass in my hand. It was still spinning, a useless piece of metal in a world that had lost its north. I thought about the 100 days, the darkness, the blood, the sheer exhausting will it took to wake up every morning when everything around me was screaming for me to give up. I thought about the men in the black vests and the way they looked at me like I was a specimen. "We keep moving," I said. My voice was a rasp, a sound made of gravel and rust. "We don't go back. We don't look for the government. We don't look for a rescue. We just look for tomorrow." I stood up, my joints popping like dry kindling. My body ached, a deep structural pain that I knew would be my constant companion from now on. I reached out a hand and pulled the woman to her feet. We stepped out of the pharmacy and back into the bruised light of the afternoon. The Pentagon was a silhouette on the horizon, a tomb for the world that was. Before us lay an endless stretch of ruins and shadows, a wilderness where the rules of civilization were nothing but dust. I was Elias. I had survived 100 days in the belly of the beast, and as the sun began to set on the 100th day, I knew that the real survival, the kind that defines a man, was only just beginning. The world was dead, but I was breathing, and for now, that had to be enough. I tightened the straps of the tactical vest, checked the safety on the SIG, and stepped into the tall grass of the median. The road ahead was long, choked with the debris of a fallen empire, but for the first time in 3 months, I wasn't waiting to be found. I was hunting for a future. The 101st day was coming, and I intended to be there to see it. The air outside the Pentagon didn't taste like the victory I had imagined during those long, claustrophobic nights in the ventilation shafts. It tasted of wet ash, stagnant water, and the cloying metallic sweetness of mass graves that no one had bothered to dig. As Sarah and I moved away from the concrete shadow of the world's most famous fortress, the silence of Northern Virginia felt heavier than the millions of tons of stone we'd left behind. It was a vacuum of physical pressure against my eardrums that made the click-clack of my tactical boots on the asphalt sound like gunshots. Sarah walked half a step behind me, her breathing ragged and uneven. She was a ghost in a stolen flight suit, her eyes darting toward every overturned sedan and rusted-out bus. I kept the Sig Sauer P226 low, my finger indexed along the slide, my mind still processing the sensory overload of the open sky. For 100 days, my horizon had been 20 feet of hallway. Now, it was miles of skeletal skyscrapers and the jagged teeth of a broken skyline. We crossed the graveyard of the eye, 395, weaving through a labyrinth of cars that had become steel coffins during the initial exodus. The windows were mostly shattered, the interiors coated in a fine layer of gray dust and dried blood. Some of the vehicles still held their occupants. Leathery, desiccated shapes slumped over steering wheels, their skin stretched tight over bone like parchment. They weren't the ones we had to worry about. It was the ones that had managed to kick the doors open that were the problem. About 2 miles out, the first test of day 101 found us. We were passing a jackknifed tanker truck when a sound like tearing silk echoed from the undercarriage. I didn't think. I reacted. I grabbed Sarah's harness and jerked her behind the rusted fender of a Chevy Suburban just as a shape launched itself from the shadows. It was a crawler, one of the ones whose legs had been crushed or rotted away, leaving nothing but a torso, driven by a singular, agonizing hunger. It dragged itself across the pavement with terrifying speed, its fingernails screeching against the asphalt, its jaw hung by a single tendon, clicking rhythmically as it lunged for my ankles. I didn't want to fire. Sound was a death sentence out here. I stepped into the lunge, bringing the butt of the cig down onto the crown of its skull. With a sickening crunch, the creature collapsed into a heap of filthy rags and gray matter, but the sound of the impact had already rippled through the stagnant air. From the hollowed-out remains of a nearby office building, a low, collective moan rose like a thermal. It started as a whisper and escalated into a discordant choir of the damned. "Run?" I hissed, grabbing Sarah's hand. We didn't head for the open road. That was a kill box. I led her toward the ruins of a strip mall, my lungs burning with the sudden exertion. The 100 days of rations and recycled air had stolen my stamina, and every step felt like running through waist-deep water. We ducked into what used to be a high-end coffee shop, the glass long gone, the floor littered with porcelain shards and blackened beans. I barricaded the door with an industrial refrigerator, my muscles screaming as I heaved the dead weight against the frame. Outside, the scratching started. Dozens of hands, some skeletal, some still fleshy and wet, scraping against the metal. Sarah sat on the floor, her head between her knees, shaking. I checked my magazines. 3 full, 1 half empty. Not enough to clear a path through a swarm. I looked at her, seeing the sheer terror in her eyes, and realized that out here, I wasn't just surviving for one anymore. I was a guardian, and that made me vulnerable in a way I hadn't been since the world ended. As the sun dipped lower, painting the ruins in hues of bruised purple and dried blood red, a new sound cut through the scratching of the dead. It was the rhythmic, mechanical throb of a heavy engine. Not a civilian car. This was the guttural growl of a turbo diesel. I climbed onto a countersink to peer through the transom window. A pair of armored Humvees, painted in a flat, matte black with a white circle on the doors, were rolling down the center of the debris-strewn street. They weren't National Guard. They lacked the markings of any official branch. Mounted on the roof of the lead vehicle was a M2 Browning, and the man behind the spade grips wasn't looking for survivors to rescue. He was scanning the ruins with a thermal optic, his movements cold and practiced. These were the Vultures, paramilitary groups that had risen from the ashes of the private security sector, men who had swapped their oaths for the law of the gun. Elias, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Is it the army? I didn't answer. I watched as the lead Humvee slowed to a crawl in front of the coffee shop. The scratching outside stopped instantly as the zombies turned their dull, predatory attention toward the new noise. The M2 opened up. The roar was deafening, a staccato rhythm that tore the air apart. I watched in grim silence as the heavy .50 caliber rounds shredded the undead like wet tissue paper. Limbs flew, torsos erupted into red mist, and within seconds, the swarm that had trapped us was nothing but a pile of twitching meat. The Humvees stopped. 4 men in full tactical gear, wearing gas masks with tinted lenses, hopped out. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace. They weren't here to save us. They were here for the same thing everyone wanted, the secrets still buried in the Pentagon, or anyone who might have slipped out with them. One of them approached the coffee shop, his boots crunching on the glass. He didn't call out. He didn't offer help. He raised a flashbang and tossed it through the broken window. I had just enough time to shove Sarah behind the counter and bury my face in my arms. The world turned into a white-hot scream of light and sound. My senses vanished, replaced by a high-pitched ringing that felt like a needle being driven into my brain. I tried to reach for my gun, but my limbs felt like lead. Through the blur of my vision, I saw the refrigerator being kicked aside, as if it were made of cardboard. Hard hands grabbed my shoulders, dragging me upright. I saw Sarah being hauled up by her hair, her face a mask of silent agony as she tried to scream. A man stood before me, his gas mask making him look like a giant insect. He reached out and snatched the Pentagon ID badge that was still clipped to my vest, the one I'd forgotten to discard. He looked at it, then looked at me, and though I couldn't see his face, I felt the cold, predatory grin behind the rubber. Colonel Vance said someone might make it out. The man's voice was muffled by his resonator, sounding like a ghost caught in a radio. He didn't think it would be a low-level grunt like you. Where's the drive, Elias? The one from the secure server in the basement? My heart stopped. Vance. I knew that name. He was the head of security for the sublevels, a man I'd thought had been eaten in the first 48 hours, when the cafeteria turned into a slaughterhouse. If he was alive, and if he had these men working for him, the Pentagon hadn't been a tomb. It had been an objective. I don't know what you're talking about. I spat, the copper taste of blood filling my mouth. The man didn't hesitate. He pulled a sidearm and shot Sarah in the thigh. The sound was muffled, suppressed, but the impact was devastating. Sarah collapsed, a guttural wet wail escaping her throat. The next one goes in her lung, the man said casually. Then the other leg. We have all night, and the noise of the .50 cal will keep the locals at bay for a while. Where is the drive? I looked at Sarah, her face turning pale as blood began to pool beneath her. I looked at the man, the symbol of everything the world had become. Cruelty without a cause, power without a purpose. I had spent 100 days fighting the dead, only to realize the living were the ones who had inherited the earth's malice. It's in the vest, I croaked, my head swimming. The hidden pocket behind the ceramic plate. The man leaned in, his greed overriding his training. He reached for my chest, his hands fumbling with the Velcro. In that split second, the 100 days of instinct took over. I didn't reach for the gun. I reached for the serrated combat knife tucked into the small of my back. I drove it upward, under the rim of his gas mask, the steel sliding into the soft tissue of his throat with a sickening squelch. He made a wet, gurgling sound as I twisted the blade, severing his carotid and his windpipe in one motion. As he slumped, I grabbed his dropped submachine gun, a suppressed MP5, and rolled over the counter. The other 3 men were outside, momentarily distracted by a scavenger that had wandered too close to their perimeter. I didn't give them a chance. I leaned over the counter and squeezed the trigger. The MP5 chattered, a muffled rhythm of death. The first man went down with a burst to the chest. The second turned, his rifle coming up. But I caught him in the visor of his mask, the glass shattering into a red spray. The third man, the one at the M2, didn't panic. He dove behind the engine block of the Humvee and began blind firing his sidearm. I scrambled to Sarah, who was drifting into shock. "Stay with me," I hissed, ripping a tourniquet from my medical pouch and cranking it down on her leg. She gasped, her eyes rolling back. I had to get her out of here, but we were pinned. The Humvee's horn began to blare, a signal. Reinforcements were coming. I looked around the coffee shop, my mind racing. In the back, there was a hatch for the basement. I grabbed Sarah under the arms and dragged her toward it, her heels furrowing the dust. I kicked the hatch open and lowered her down into the darkness just as a grenade detonated in the front of the shop, raining plaster and fire down on where we had been standing seconds before. The basement was a narrow, concrete tunnel, a utility crawl space that connected to the city's ancient steam pipe network. I dropped down, slamming the hatch shut and sliding the bolt. We were in total darkness. The only sound the distant, muffled thud of boots above us and the hiss of escaping steam. I turned on my weapon light, the beam cutting through the gloom to reveal a labyrinth of rusted pipes and dripping condensation. Sarah was unconscious now, her breathing shallow. I had saved her from the dead and the vultures, but she was bleeding out in a hole in the ground, while a madman I used to call Sir hunted us with a private army. I sat there in the dark, the weight of the 101st day pressing down on me like the layers of the Pentagon. I had thought the hardest part was getting out. I was wrong. Getting out was just the birth. Now I had to survive the life. I looked at the MP5 in my lap, the cold steel a grim reminder of the escalation. This wasn't a survival story anymore. This was a war. Vance wanted the data. Data I didn't even have. Data he only thought I had because I'd survived where everyone else had died. He had turned me into a target, a vessel for his own ambition, in a world that had no room for it. Hours passed. The sounds above faded, replaced by the low tectonic groans of the city settling. I managed to stabilize Sarah, packing the wound with gauze and pumping her full of the last of my antibiotics. She was stable, but she couldn't walk. I was trapped again, but this time the walls weren't made of reinforced concrete. They were made of shadows and the unknown. I began to move, carrying her over my shoulder like a rucksack, my boots splashing in the oily water of the tunnels. I followed the slope of the pipes, heading toward the river, hoping the darkness of the subterranean world would be kinder than the light of the ruins. As I walked, I felt a change in the air, a shift in the pressure. The tunnels began to widen, opening into a massive junction box where the DC metro lines intersected. It was a cathedral of grime, the rails stretching into infinity like the ribs of a giant beast. And there, in the flickering orange glow of a dying emergency light, I saw them. Not the dead, not the vultures, but the others, dozens of them, living in the skeletons of the train cars. They were gaunt, their clothes rags, their eyes reflecting the light like animals. They didn't move to attack. They just watched. In their center stood a woman, her hair shorn to the scalp, a jagged scar running from her ear to her chin. She held a crossbow, leveled at my chest. "The surface is for the ghosts and the monsters," she said, her voice like grinding stones. "Down here, we have different rules. Who are you, soldier? And why have you brought the war into our house?" I lowered Sarah gently to the ground, my hands held wide, the MP5 hanging from its sling. I looked at the faces of the hidden city, the people the world had forgotten even before it ended. I was Elias. I had survived 100 days in the belly of the beast. I had walked through fire and shadow, and I had lost almost everything but my will to breathe. "I'm a man who's tired of running," I said, my voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling of the station. "And I'm a man who's going to kill the people who are coming for us. If you want to stay hidden, you're going to need more than luck. You're going to need someone who knows how the monsters think." The woman lowered the crossbow an inch, her eyes searching mine. Behind her, the tunnels seemed to breathe, 1,000 heartbeats thrumming in the dark. The 101st day was almost over, and as the cold, damp of the tunnels settled into my bones, I knew the real fight hadn't even begun. The Pentagon was a tomb, but the world outside was a furnace, and I was being forged into something I no longer recognized. I took a breath, the air thick with the scent of the deep earth, and waited for the darkness to answer. I had survived the 100, but the 101st had taught me the most bitter lesson of all. In the kingdom of the dead, the living are the most dangerous things of all. I reached down, took Sarah's hand, and prepared to negotiate for our lives with the only currency I had left, the violence I had mastered in the dark. The future was a jagged, broken thing, but I was still standing, and for now, that was the only victory that mattered. The woman didn't lower her weapon entirely, but the tension in her shoulders shifted, a tectonic plate of hostility sliding into a wary, jagged truce. She called herself Miller, a name that felt as utilitarian and cold as the steel of her crossbow. And she led us deeper into the bowels of the Pentagon's sub-basements, past the point where the blueprints ended and the myths began. This wasn't the polished marble and bureaucratic efficiency of the upper floors. This was the gut of the beast, a damp, thrumming labyrinth of steam pipes and forgotten Cold War machinery that smelled of ozone and ancient dust. For 3 miles we walked in a silence so heavy, it felt like it was filling my lungs with lead. Sarah clutched my hand, her fingers trembling but her grip firm, a silent anchor in a world that had lost its gravity. Miller's people emerged from the shadows like ghosts birthed from the concrete, men and women with hollowed eyes and skin the color of ash, draped in tactical gear that had seen better decades. They were the remnants of a security detail that had been forgotten by the chain of command, a splinter cell of the living who had traded their humanity for the cold arithmetic of survival. Miller explained the situation in clipped, brutal sentences. The Pentagon wasn't just a fortress. It was a hive. The shamblers we had fought on the upper levels were nothing compared to what was brewing in the ventilation shafts. The blind ones, evolved by the darkness, hunters that didn't need eyes to find a heartbeat. They were losing the lower levels, and the only way out was a pressurized maintenance tunnel that led under the Potomac, a path that had been sealed from the outside to contain the infection. To open it, someone had to reach the auxiliary control room in sublevel 7, a place that had become a charnel house. I looked at my hands, the skin stained with the grease of a dozen different weapons and the dried blood of creatures that used to be men. I wasn't the person who had walked into this building 100 days ago. That man was a ghost, a soft, fearful thing that had died somewhere between the cafeteria massacre and the long nights in the ventilation ducts. I was a predator now, a creature of reflex and adrenaline, and as I agreed to lead the charge into Sublevel 7, I felt a sickening sense of belonging. This was my world now. We moved out at what would have been dawn, though time down here was measured only by the flickering of dying fluorescent bulbs. The descent was a plunge into a nightmare. The walls were slick with a black, bioluminescent fungus that pulsed in time with the thrumming of the pipes, and the air grew thick with a cloying, sweet rot that made my stomach churn. We found the first of the blind ones in a collapsed server room. It was a pale, elongated horror, its skin stretched thin over a skeleton that seemed to have too many joints. It didn't moan, it clicked, a rhythmic, predatory sound that echoed off the metal cabinets. I didn't wait for Miller's command. I moved with a fluidity that terrified me, my knife finding the soft spot at the base of the creature's skull before it could even turn. There was no triumph in the kill, only the cold satisfaction of a machine functioning as intended. We fought our way through the dark, a slow, grinding progression, through a sea of grasping limbs and chattering teeth. Sarah stayed in the center of our formation, her face a mask of grim determination, holding a flare gun like it was a holy relic. She was the only thing that kept me from fully dissolving into the violence, the only spark of the world that was worth saving. In Sublevel 7, the horror reached its zenith. The room was a cathedral of gore, the walls plastered with the remains of the workers who had tried to hold the line during the first week. In the center of the room sat the console, guarded by something that had once been a high-ranking officer, now a bloated, multi-limbed mass of fused flesh and uniform scraps. It was the Alpha, a nexus of the infection that seemed to hum with a psychic malevolence. Miller's team fell back, the sheer scale of the nightmare breaking their disciplined resolve. But I didn't have the luxury of fear. I had lived 100 days in a tomb. I wasn't going to die in the basement. I charged, the world narrowing down to the weight of the axe in my hand and the rhythm of my own breathing. The fight was a blur of wet impacts and the scream of tearing metal. I felt teeth graze my shoulder, felt the hot spray of ichor across my face, but I didn't stop until the Alpha was a heap of unmoving meat. My breath came in ragged, burning gasps as I reached for the manual override. I pulled the lever, and the building groaned, a deep, tectonic protest, as the seals on the Potomac Tunnel began to hiss open. But the victory was hollow. As the lights flickered to a steady, emergency red, I saw the cost. Miller was down, her chest a ruin, and 2 of her men were already turning, their eyes clouding over with the milky film of the virus. I grabbed Sarah, and we ran. We didn't look back as the sounds of the dying and the reanimating echoed behind us. The maintenance tunnel was a mile of narrow, claustrophobic darkness, the sound of the river rushing above us a constant, thundering reminder of the weight of the world. My legs felt like they were made of glass, every step a gamble against collapse. But the thought of the sky, the real sky, not the ceiling of a bunker, pushed me forward. We reached the exit hatch at the far end of the river, a rusted iron disc that felt like it weighed 1,000 tons. I put my shoulder to it, screaming with a rage that had been building for 100 days, and felt the seal break. The air that rushed in wasn't the fresh, crisp breeze I had imagined. It was hot, acrid, and smelled of wood smoke and old ash. We climbed out into the ruins of Arlington, emerging from a utility shed into a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. The sun was a bloated orange orb hanging in a sky choked with the haze of 1,000 fires. Washington, D.C. lay across the water, a skeleton of a city, its iconic monuments chipped and blackened like broken teeth. There were no sirens, no hum of traffic, no signs of the civilization I had spent 100 days mourning. There was only the wind whistling through the empty windows of abandoned apartment complexes and the distant, rhythmic moaning of the dead that roamed the streets in numbers that defied comprehension. I sat on the scorched earth, my back against the shed, and let the sun burn against my skin. Sarah sat beside me, her head resting on my shoulder, her hand still locked in mine. We had survived the Pentagon. We had conquered the dark. But as I looked out at the burning horizon, I realized that the real fight Miller had spoken of wasn't about reclaimed territory or finding a cure. It was about the endurance of the soul in a world that no longer had a place for it. The 101st day was ending, and the 102nd was a vast, terrifying blank page. I looked at the knife at my belt, then at the girl by my side. I had become a monster to survive the monsters. But as Sarah looked up at me, her eyes filled with a fragile, stubborn hope, I knew I couldn't let the darkness win the final battle. I reached into my pack and pulled out the last of our rations, a bruised apple I'd scavenged from a break room a lifetime ago. I handed it to her, and for the first time in over 3 months, I felt a smile ghost across my lips. It was a small thing, a tiny act of grace in a world of cruelty, but it was the only weapon I had left that mattered. The Pentagon was behind us, a monument to a fallen world, but we were moving forward. We were the inheritors of the ash, the kings of the ruins, and though the road ahead was a jagged, broken thing, we would walk it together. I stood up, my joints popping like gunfire, and offered Sarah my hand. The world was a furnace, and we were being forged, but we were not broken. Not yet. We stepped out into the waist-high weeds of the new world, 2 small figures against the backdrop of a dying empire, and began the long walk into the unknown. The 100 days were over. Our lives were just beginning, and as the first stars began to pierce through the smoke of the burning Capitol, I realized that survival wasn't about the absence of death, but the presence of a reason to live. I had found mine in the dark, and I would defend it until the world itself stopped turning. We disappeared into the shadows of the ruins, not as victims, but as the new architects of a world that would have to learn our names. The silence of the 101st day was finally broken by the sound of our footsteps, steady and defiant, echoing into the heart of the furnace. We were alive, and for now, that was the only victory that mattered. We walked until the Pentagon was nothing more than a squat, dark shape on the horizon, a tomb we had outlived, and as the night air cooled, I felt the fire within me settle into a steady, enduring flame. We were the living, the most dangerous things of all, and we were coming for the dawn.